pregnant, widowed, and banished woman moves to a cabin in the woods, but something strange was waiting. Grace Hartwell pressed her back against the cabin wall, breathing hard. The flickering candlelight barely showed her face, pale, tired, streaked with tears. Her husband's old flannel shirt hung loose over her growing belly. The night outside was silent, too silent. She reached for the old lantern on the table, but the flame inside burned an unnatural shade of blue. Her fingers froze mid-E. The temperature dropped so suddenly her breath turned to mist. From the broken window came a faint giggle, a child's voice. Grace turned toward the door, clutching her stomach, whispering to the baby she carried. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. The car tires outside had been slashed. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't want her to leave. The walls creaked. Footsteps moved slowly across the porch. Grace's trembling hand reached for the shotgun leaning beside the chair. Her heart pounded as she whispered, "I've already lost everything. What more do you want from me?" This widow had lost everything, but the thing waiting in these Oregon woods was about to teach her that sometimes our greatest terrors hold our greatest salvation. What was lurking in the darkness of that abandoned cabin? Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story will chill you even deeper. Grace Hartwell had once believed Bend, Oregon was the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. The town sat quietly along the Deschutes River, framed by the distant peaks of the Three Sisters Mountains. Summers smelled of pine and river dust. Winters brought soft silence. She and Thomas had built a life that was small but content. He worked in the woods with the logging crews. She stitched quilts for the local shop and spent afternoons reading by the window of their rented cottage. They didn't have much, but they had peace, and each other. That peace ended 3 months ago in the Deschutes National Forest. A logging accident, the kind the crews whispered about but never expected. Thomas was crushed beneath a fallen tree. The foreman said it was instant. Grace never saw the body, only the folded flag the company handed her, and a small envelope with his unpaid wages. After the funeral, the house felt too quiet. Every evening she still set 2 plates at the table, unable to stop herself. She'd wake in the middle of the night, reaching across the bed for a man who wasn't there. When her hand met the cold sheet, the truth struck her again like fresh pain. It should have been her time to heal. Instead, Thomas's family turned cruel. His mother called her a burden, whispering that Grace had brought misfortune. "You're alone now," the old woman said one night, her voice like a knife. "You have no claim here. My son is gone. You should start over somewhere else." Grace tried to hold her ground, but the tension grew until the threat became real. Leave, or they'd take her unborn child. The baby was all she had left of Thomas, and she refused to let anyone near it. So she packed what little she owned, some clothes, a photo album, a few tools, and left the next morning. She had a small inheritance from her mother, barely enough to buy an old car and pay for a few months of living. The rest she kept hidden in her purse, folded in an envelope labeled for the baby. When the money began to run out, she started looking for somewhere cheap, anywhere she could be left alone. That's how she ended up in Oak Ridge, a small logging town at the edge of the Willamette National Forest. The real estate office smelled of dust and coffee. The man behind the counter looked nervous when she asked about isolated properties. "There's one place," he said, tapping a folder on his desk. "The old Peterson place. Been empty since '52. 40 miles up Forest Road 24. No power lines, no neighbors. Not much left of it, really." Grace asked the price. When he told her, she almost laughed. It was all she had left. She signed the papers that day. The man tried to warn her. "Folks say it's bad luck up there. People hear things in those woods." She only nodded. After everything she'd lost, she didn't fear bad luck anymore. The drive up was long and winding. Forest Road 24 cut through miles of deep green. The trees grew thicker the higher she climbed, their tops lost in clouds. Her old station wagon rattled over every bump, the radio dead, the air cold. She stopped twice to stretch and talk softly to the child inside her. "We're almost there," she whispered, resting her hand on her stomach. "It won't be much, but it'll be hours." By the time she reached the turnoff, daylight was fading. The road narrowed to a single lane of dirt, lined with ferns and fallen branches. She passed no houses, no mailboxes, nothing but forest and fog. The cabin finally appeared around a bend, a dark shape among the trees. She parked the car and stared at it through the windshield. The roof sagged under years of moss. Windows were black, like eyes that hadn't seen life in decades. Smoke hadn't risen from its chimney in generations. For a long time she just sat there, both comforted and unsettled by the silence. This was where she would begin again. Alone, yes, but free. No one to tell her what to do. No pitying looks, no whispering relatives. Just her baby, and the endless forest. She stepped out of the car. The ground was soft from recent rain. Her boots sank slightly into the mud. She walked toward the front door, every step echoing in her chest like a heartbeat. A loose shutter slammed against the wall as the wind picked up, making her flinch. Inside, through the broken window, she saw nothing but darkness. The smell of old wood and rot drifted out, mingled with the faint scent of wet earth. It wasn't much, but it was something she could shape into her own. She went back to the car before night fully fell, deciding to sleep there for now. Her hands trembled as she locked the doors. The wind moved through the trees, whispering like voices she couldn't quite make out. She pulled Thomas's flannel shirt tighter around her and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she told herself, she'd start cleaning. Tomorrow, she'd make it livable. Tonight, she just needed rest. As darkness swallowed the clearing, Grace lay awake, her mind replaying the words she'd heard earlier that day from the agent. No one's lived there since 1952. She wondered why he'd sounded so uneasy when he said it. The forest gave no answer. Only the steady hum of wind and rain against the glass, and the faint feeling that somewhere beyond the trees, something had noticed her arrival. The next morning, sunlight crept through the fog, thin and pale. Grace sat in the driver's seat of her station wagon, watching the cabin through the windshield. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss, green and heavy. The wood was dark with years of rain. The windows were empty holes, black and cold, reflecting nothing. Around her, the forest pressed close, towering Douglas firs that seemed to grow right out of the earth's ribs. Their branches shut out the sky. Even the air felt thick. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just silence, deep and unbroken, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Grace rubbed her belly gently. "It's just old," she whispered to the baby. "That's all." She needed to believe it. She'd promised herself she wouldn't run anymore. When she finally stepped out of the car, the chill caught her lungs. Her boots sank into the damp ground as she moved toward the porch. Every step made the boards creak. She touched the door handle. It was cold, as if it hadn't been touched by human hands in decades. She turned it. The door didn't budge. A sharp pull made it groan open, revealing a wave of dust and the smell of rot. For a moment, she almost turned back, but something inside her refused. This place was hers now, whether it wanted her or not. The first room was small. A stone fireplace leaned against the far wall, cracked but still standing. A rusted bed frame lay toppled over in the corner. Decades of leaves covered the floor. Mice had built nests in what used to be a cupboard. The walls were split with gaps that let in fingers of cold air. She covered her nose with her sleeve and walked deeper inside. The second room was even smaller, no larger than a storage shed. The remains of an old chair sat against the wall, half eaten by time. Someone had scratched letters into the wooden door frame long ago, but they were too faded to read. Grace stood in the doorway, silent, overwhelmed by what lay ahead. She could almost hear Thomas's voice teasing gently, "You always take the hardest road, Gracie." Her eyes burned. "You'd have done the same," she whispered back. That night she slept in the car again, too uneasy to stay inside. Every sound made her tense, the distant snap of a branch, the slow roll of wind through the trees. She wrapped Thomas's flannel shirt tighter around herself and stared up at the dark ceiling of the car. She prayed morning would come quickly. When it did, she forced herself back to the cabin. The air smelled of wet pine and soil. She opened every window she could, letting in what little sunlight reached through the trees. Dust floated in the air like snow. With a broom in one hand and an old rag in the other, she began the long work of reclaiming what time had taken. The days blurred into one another. She swept until her back ached, scrubbed until her hands cracked, patched holes with scraps of cloth and old boards she found in a shed nearby. Each night she'd collapse into the sleeping bag she'd unrolled near the fireplace, exhausted but proud. It took her nearly 2 weeks to make the place livable. The stone fireplace became her center. Once she managed to get it working, the cabin no longer felt entirely dead. She found an old hand pump behind the cabin, still attached to a shallow well. The water was cold and metallic, but it was clean enough to drink. Each small victory gave her strength. A floor she could walk on without splinters. A fire that stayed lit through the night. A door that finally shut tight against the wind. Still, isolation settled deep. She hadn't seen another human face since leaving Oak Ridge. The mail route didn't come this far. Her phone had no signal. The road back down the mountain was too long to risk in her aging car. So she stayed, speaking only to her unborn child. In the evening she'd heat canned soup over the fire and talk softly as she ate. "You're safe now," she'd say, resting her hand on her belly. "Mama's got you." She kept Thomas's hunting knife beside her at all times, not from fear of animals. There were none, but from the strange feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes at night she'd wake to the stillness pressing on her ears, so heavy it almost had weight. No wind. No movement. Just silence so complete it felt alive. She'd listen until her heart slowed, then whisper to the baby again. Just the woods settling, she'd tell herself, though she wasn't sure she believed it. By the end of the second week, the cabin finally looked like a home, at least on the surface. The walls no longer smelled of mildew. The floor was swept, her few belongings neatly arranged. She even hung Thomas's jacket by the door, a small reminder of the life she'd lost. But the forest never seemed to approve of her presence. On some mornings, she'd open the door and feel the trees looming closer than before, their trunks forming tight lines as if they were closing in. The sky above them stayed gray, even when the weather reports promised clear skies. On the 14th night, Grace sat by the fire, talking quietly to her child as the flames danced across the walls. "We did it," she said softly. "We made it work." The baby kicked in response, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Outside, the forest stood still. No wind, no sound. The fire cracked once, loud in the emptiness. Grace froze, her eyes darting toward the door. Nothing. Just the same quiet. She shook her head, forcing a small laugh. "You're just tired," she murmured to herself, lying down. The fire burned low, casting faint light on the wooden walls. When she woke sometime before dawn, the fire had died to embers. The air inside was colder than before. She reached for her blanket but stopped halfway. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. Something about it felt aware. Grace sat up, every muscle tight, straining to hear. There was no sound, yet she could feel it, the sense of eyes somewhere in the dark. Watching. Waiting. The 15th night was coming. And the forest, so quiet until now, felt like it was holding its breath for what came next. On the 15th night, Grace woke to a sound she couldn't place. It was faint at first, something soft but steady, like nails brushing against old wood. Her eyes snapped open in the dark. The fire had gone out. Only the grey outline of the window marked where night ended and deeper night began. The sound came again, scratching. Slow, rhythmic, dragging across the wall near her bed. She pushed herself upright, her heart hammering so hard it made her breath tremble. For a moment, she thought it might be an animal. But no creature moved like that. It circled the cabin. East wall first, then north. The noise moved too smoothly, too deliberate, like whatever made it was mapping the walls, testing them. Grace reached for Thomas's hunting knife, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed pressed against her ears until she could hear her own pulse. She waited. Nothing. She thought it was over, until she heard breathing. It came from the other side of the bedroom door. Heavy. Wet. Each inhale sounded close enough to fog the air under the crack. Her throat tightened. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked on the second word. No reply. Only the faint hiss of air moving in and out of something unseen. She stayed frozen for hours, the knife clutched to her chest. Every time she blinked, she expected to open her eyes and see the door moving. But the night dragged on without another sound. When the first light of dawn seeped through the window, Grace stood, stiff and weak. She opened the door carefully, her breath held. The air was sharp with cold. The front room was empty. She stepped outside barefoot, the ground biting at her skin. There were no tracks in the mud. No claw marks on the walls. No sign that anything had been there. By daylight, it felt almost like a dream, but she knew it wasn't. The next night came faster than she wanted. She'd barely eaten. She tried to keep the fire alive, tried to tell herself it was nothing more than wind or rats in the walls. But when darkness returned, the sounds returned with it, earlier this time. It started above her. Something scraped against the roof, dragging slowly across the shingles, heavy enough to make the ceiling creak. She gripped the knife tighter and held her breath. The sound moved to the far corner, paused, then crawled back. Grace stood and lit every candle she owned, setting them in a circle around her. The flickering light threw moving shadows on the walls, and she couldn't tell which ones were hers. Outside, she heard footsteps. Not running, walking. Measured. Slow. The sound circled the cabin once, twice. She counted them in her head, each crunch of weight through the damp soil. The door handle rattled. Once. Then again. Harder. It turned slightly, testing the latch. Grace screamed before she could stop herself. "Leave me alone. There's nothing here for you." The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it made her dizzy. Then a new sound broke it, a child's laugh. High and sweet, drifting through the walls. Grace froze, the knife trembling in her grip. The laughter wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. Above her. Beneath her. All around. She backed into the corner and sank to the floor, eyes wide, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't remember falling asleep. Only waking at dawn again, shaking, the candles burned to nothing but puddles of wax. The 16th day passed like a blur. Grace kept the knife close as she gathered what she could for defense. Wooden boards, the heavy iron poker, a broken piece of pipe she found near the well. She considered leaving, but the nearest town was miles away, and the mountain roads were treacherous. Still, she couldn't stay another night in that cabin. When the sun began to drop, she made her decision. She would sleep in the car. It wasn't much, but it had doors she could lock. She packed a blanket, her water jug, and a small flashlight, then stepped outside. The air was cold, sharper than usual. Her breath fogged in front of her. The car sat a few feet away, its metal surface slick with dew. She reached for the handle, and froze. All 4 tires were slashed. The rubber hung in ribbons, sliced clean through. She opened the driver's door and stared inside. The seats were torn apart, stuffing scattered like feathers across the dashboard. The smell of gasoline hung in the air. Her only escape was gone. Grace backed away slowly, her hand over her mouth, struggling not to cry. Someone, or something, had made sure she couldn't leave. The realization settled like ice in her chest. Whatever this was, it wanted her here. She stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. The lock clicked, but it felt useless now. She pushed furniture against the entrance, nailed boards over the window frames with trembling hands. Every noise outside made her flinch. When she was done, she stood in the center of the room, panting, her face streaked with sweat and dust. The baby kicked, and she placed both hands over her stomach. "I won't let anything hurt you," she whispered. "Not while I'm breathing." That night, she didn't try to sleep. She sat near the fire with the knife across her lap and whispered a prayer, not just to Thomas, but to her mother, to anyone who might be listening. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "I can't do this alone." The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the shutters like something trying to get in. The flames flickered. Grace pressed her back against the wall, gripping the knife until her knuckles whitened. She whispered again into the dark, "If you can hear me, don't let it take us." The answer came not in words, but in silence, the kind that feels alive, waiting. By the 3rd night, the cabin no longer felt like shelter. Every board, every window seemed alive with tension. Grace didn't sleep. She sat by the dying fire, the knife across her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. The sound started later than before, soft, almost polite. A slow drag along the wall, as if announcing itself. Grace didn't move. Her heartbeat felt louder than the noise itself. When the temperature began to fall, she saw her breath cloud in front of her face. Frost crept up the inside of the window pane. The flames in the fireplace dipped low, then shifted color, blue, cold, unnatural. The shadows along the far wall deepened until one began to move. It stretched upward, taller than any person, its edges twisting like smoke caught in wind. Grace froze. The shape wasn't cast by the fire. It stood on its own. Her breath came in short bursts. She gripped the knife tighter, but her fingers had gone numb. The air itself seemed to hum, low and uneven. The candle flames bent away from the shadow, as though afraid. Then came the voices. Dozens of them, whispering at once in a language she didn't know. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled every space in her skull. It carried grief, fury, something ancient that pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. She didn't understand the words, but her body did. They were the sounds of loss, of being left behind, of love turned to pain. Grace backed into the corner, one hand over her belly. She closed her eyes and thought of Thomas, of her mother, of the night she'd prayed for something, anything, to stop the loneliness. The whispers grew louder, spinning into a single thread of sound that pulsed through the room. Grace's fear burned so hot it began to change. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was angry, angry at fate, at the forest, at whatever stood before her and dared to torment her child. Her voice came out rough but steady. "I don't know what you are," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "But I'm not leaving." The shadow paused. The whispers faltered. Grace took a step forward. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, louder now, her voice shaking the still air. "This is my home." Mine and my baby's. The flames wavered violently, throwing streaks of blue across the walls. The shadow's height seemed to shrink, its edges curling inward. Grace raised the knife, her hand trembling but her stare fixed. You want to hurt me? Then do it. But I won't run anymore. I can't. The cabin went utterly still. The whispering stopped as if someone had cut the sound from the world. For a moment, Grace thought her heart had stopped too. The silence stretched, long enough to make her dizzy. Then a single voice spoke. It was soft, female, and carried a weight that made the air tremble. You were not afraid of me, the voice said. You were afraid of being alone. Grace's grip loosened. Her throat ached. She lowered the knife slowly, staring at the space where the shadow had been. The blue flames shifted back to yellow, flickering gently as warmth returned to the air. Frost melted from the glass, dripping down like tears. Before her eyes, the darkness began to change. The tall, formless shape condensed, pulling inward until it became the outline of a woman. The air shimmered, thin as mist, until the figure stood clear, a translucent form, dressed in traditional clothing of a time long past. Her long black hair fell in waves, and her eyes, deep, endless, were filled with sorrow rather than malice. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. What are you? The spirit tilted her head, the faint sound of wind moving through leaves echoing as she spoke again. Once, this land was mine, she said softly. This home belonged to my people. We were driven away, our voices forgotten. For years I watched them take, destroy, leave nothing but silence. You are the first to stay. Grace stood motionless, tears tracing her cheeks. The knife slipped from her hand, falling to the floor with a dull clang. I didn't mean to take what isn't mine, Grace whispered. I just needed somewhere safe. Somewhere my baby could live. The spirit's form wavered as though the words had reached her. You came here broken, yet you gave life to a place filled with death. She looked toward the small bedroll near the fire. You are not trespassing, Grace Hartwell. You are restoring what was taken. The room grew warmer still. The flames rose higher, glowing gold against the stone. For the first time since arriving, Grace felt a strange calm settle over her. The spirit's face softened. You carry both pain and hope, she said. That child will know what it means to endure. Grace stepped closer, hesitant but unafraid. Are you the one who made the sounds? Who took my tires? The spirit nodded once, a faint shimmer crossing her face. I needed you to stay. I could not speak until you stopped running. Grace's knees weakened. She sank to the floor, clutching her stomach. Why me? She whispered. Because you know what it is to lose everything, the spirit said. And still keep moving. The candles flared once more, their flames bending toward the woman as if drawn by her presence. Grace could feel warmth return to her fingertips, the air no longer heavy but alive. The spirit began to fade, her form scattering like mist touched by morning light. Her last words drifted through the air, gentle as breath. Do not fear this place. It will protect you now. Grace reached out a trembling hand, but the space before her was empty. Only the sound of the fire remained, steady and soft. She sat there until sunrise, watching light crawl slowly across the floorboards. The knife lay forgotten beside her. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel alone. The cabin glowed with warmth that night, though no fire burned in the hearth. Grace sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the faint shimmer forming before her. The spirit's shape wavered like mist caught in candlelight. When she spoke, her voice was calm and heavy with memory. I am what remains of one who was broken by cruelty, she said. My name is Bright Morning. Her words carried the weight of centuries. Grace listened, barely breathing. In the year 1852, I lived here, the spirit continued, with my husband and our daughter, Willow. This cabin was our home. We built it from the trees around us, believing it would protect us from the world. Her tone softened, but her face darkened with sorrow. That first winter was kind. The second was not. Sickness came with the cold. It took my husband first. Then my little girl. Both gone before the snow melted. Grace's hand moved to her chest, as if she could feel the pain echo through time. When the tribe came, Bright Morning said, they saw my grief and called it a curse. They said my spirit had called death to my own family. They drove me away. Her form flickered, the light around her dimming. I was with child again. I thought I could survive here, alone. I was wrong. Grace's eyes filled. She whispered, "You died here." The spirit nodded slowly. I did. My child with me. I tried to bring life into the world again, but death reached for us both. The silence that followed felt too heavy to bear. Grace's tears fell freely. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "No one deserves that kind of pain." Bright Morning looked at her with an expression that was both gratitude and grief. For 135 years, I haunted this place. Families came and went. None stayed long. I frightened them away with sounds and shadows. I told myself I was protecting what was mine, but I was only protecting my sorrow. Her gaze lowered. My pain became anger. My anger became all that I was. I forgot who I had been before the loss. Grace listened quietly, every word sinking deep into her chest. "But you," the spirit's voice softened. "You were different. You didn't flee when I tried to drive you out. You stood your ground." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "Yes," Bright Morning said. "But you stood anyway. You stayed not out of pride, but out of love, for the child you carry, for the memory of the man you lost. You faced the darkness because you had nothing left but your will to protect what's coming next." Her expression gentled, the sorrow in her features easing. "You reminded me of myself before the pain changed me. You faced the same silence I once did, but instead of surrendering to it, you spoke into it. You turned your fear into courage." Grace swallowed hard. "I only did what I had to." The spirit's eyes glowed faintly. "You did more than that. You broke the cycle of my hatred with your defiance and your love. I saw my reflection in your strength. You faced what most run from, and in doing so, you freed me from what I became." Grace's hands trembled. She reached forward instinctively, her fingertips brushing through empty air where the spirit stood. "What happens now?" Bright Morning smiled, the faintest shimmer crossing her translucent face. "Now, I can finally rest." Grace's breath caught. "You mean you're leaving?" The spirit shook her head gently. "Not yet. Before I go, I can give you what was never given to me." Grace frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Help," Bright Morning said simply. "The help of another mother who faced the same pain. You carry life, and this place has known too much death. Let me guide you through what is to come." Grace could barely speak. "Why? After everything, why help me?" "Because kindness was what I needed most and received least," the spirit replied. "Because you gave it to me, without even knowing. Now I can return it." The light surrounding her brightened, filling every shadow in the cabin. "There is strength in you, Grace Hartwell. But even strength needs rest, and even courage needs guidance. The days ahead will test you in ways the forest never could." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you." "Live," Bright Morning said. "Bring your child safely into this world. That will be thanks enough." The flickering light softened into a calm glow that filled the room with warmth. The spirit's voice became a whisper. I stayed in this place because I was afraid to let go. You reminded me that even grief can be turned into something pure. Grace closed her eyes, breathing deeply. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt peace, real peace. When she opened them again, bright morning was still there, watching her with eyes full of ancient tenderness. I will stay until you no longer need me, the spirit said softly. But remember, what you fear most is not the darkness outside these walls. It's the silence within your own heart. When you learn to fill it with love instead of loss, nothing can touch you. The candles flickered once more. Grace felt the air grow lighter, her exhaustion replaced by quiet determination. Outside, the wind rose, whispering through the trees. It no longer sounded empty. It sounded alive. Grace sat by the fire until morning, her hand resting over her belly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't cry from pain. She cried from the strange, healing comfort of being understood by a soul who had suffered and survived, even beyond death. And as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls, Grace whispered, "Thank you, bright morning." The spirit's voice, soft and distant, answered through the quiet air. You will not walk this path alone. The following weeks passed like a dream Grace could neither explain nor question. The forest that had once pressed on her from all sides now seemed to breathe with her. She began to notice quiet changes. Small at first, barely noticeable, but impossible to ignore. Each morning, she woke to find neat stacks of chopped wood outside the cabin door, the axe still clean and dry. She hadn't cut it. She hadn't even heard a sound through the night. The gaps in the walls that once let in freezing air now glistened with fresh moss and packed earth, as if the forest itself had decided to mend her shelter. Grace didn't speak of it aloud. She simply touched the newly sealed spaces with her fingertips and whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure to whom. The cold deepened as the season shifted. One morning, she woke shivering, her body weak and burning with fever. The world around her blurred, breath shallow, pain stabbing through her temples. The days that followed were lost to drifting in and out of sleep. She remembered flashes, the sound of crackling fire, the taste of something bitter on her lips, a voice humming softly in the dark. When she finally opened her eyes for good, the room glowed warm and golden. A thick blanket, woven with colors she didn't own, was wrapped around her shoulders. On the hearth, a pot of tea steamed, the scent sharp and soothing, like pine and earth after rain. She sat up slowly. The fire burned strong. Someone had tended it. Grace poured a cup with trembling hands and drank. The liquid was warm but unfamiliar, its taste deep and natural. As it slid down her throat, her fever eased, her head cleared, and her strength returned. That night, bright morning appeared again. Her glow was softer now, no longer harsh or startling. Her presence filled the cabin like moonlight. "You were very ill," she said quietly. "I made tea from the roots that grow by the river's bend. They draw heat from the body and restore balance." Grace stared, overwhelmed. "You saved me." The spirit smiled faintly. "No. I only shared what the earth already knows." After that night, bright morning came often. Each evening, after the sun dipped below the treetops, her light shimmered near the hearth. She was no longer a figure of fear but of quiet company. Grace began to look forward to her visits. Hours passed as they spoke. Bright morning taught her which berries would nourish her and which could sicken her, how to tell when the river was safe to draw from, and how to read the coming weather in the stillness of the trees or the flight of birds. She taught her how to find edible roots beneath the frost, how to mend torn clothing with strands of bark, and how to survive a mountain winter alone. Grace listened, learning everything with gratitude and wonder. The spirit's voice was patient and steady, like water moving over stone. One night, Bright Morning told her stories of her people, their life in rhythm with the land, their belief that every tree had a soul, every river a memory. She spoke of resilience, of rebuilding after loss, of finding peace by honoring the balance between grief and gratitude. Grace sat by the fire, her hand resting on her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. The spirit was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Because kindness was what I needed most and received least. Because your courage reminded me that love is stronger than grief. And because every soul deserves what we both were denied, compassion in our darkest hour." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to repay you." Bright Morning's voice was calm. "You already have. You gave me what I'd forgotten, that even in loneliness, we can still choose kindness. It changes everything." Days grew shorter. Frost painted the trees white, and snow began to fall in gentle sheets, softening every edge of the forest. The cabin, once cold and broken, was now a warm haven. The roof no longer leaked. The fire burned steady each night. The water from the well ran clear. Grace had stored jars of food along the shelves, dried beans, smoked fish, and the preserves she'd made from late autumn berries. Piles of firewood filled one corner, and the floor was swept clean. She sat one evening watching snowflakes drift past the window, her belly heavy with life, her heart unexpectedly light. Bright Morning appeared beside her, faint but smiling. "You are ready," she said. "When the time comes, you will not be alone." Grace nodded, eyes glistening. "It's strange," she said. "When I first came here, I thought this cabin would be my prison. Now it feels like the only place I can breathe." "That is how healing works," Bright Morning said. "It begins as a wound and becomes a doorway." The first snow of December deepened into silence outside. Grace felt her baby move, a strong, insistent flutter, and pressed her palm against her stomach, whispering a soft prayer of thanks. The days passed with quiet rhythm. Morning chores, small meals, nights by the fire. She no longer feared the shadows or the sounds of the forest. The woods around her seemed to watch over her rather than threaten her. Bright Morning came and went like the tide, always near when Grace needed her most. Together they existed in a fragile harmony, one living, one bound by memory, both drawing strength from each other. By late December, Grace could feel the time drawing close. The baby would arrive soon. She had prepared everything she could: clean linens, warm blankets, water, and courage. One evening, as snow piled high against the cabin door, she stood by the window, looking out at the silent forest. The moonlight shimmered across the drifts, turning the world to silver. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, for all of it." A faint voice answered, carried by the wind through the cracks in the wall. "Rest, Grace. The hardest part is almost over." January was coming. So was her child. And for the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel afraid. The storm arrived before midnight, thick snow falling in relentless sheets. Wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters as if the forest itself were warning her. Grace woke to a sharp cramp that took her breath away. She froze, hand pressed against her stomach. Another came, stronger this time, deeper. It was time. She sat up, panic rising in her throat. 40 miles from the nearest hospital. No phone. No neighbors. No one who could hear her cry for help. Her body trembled as another wave of pain rolled through her. She gripped the edge of the bed, whispering, "Not tonight. Please, not alone." But she wasn't alone. A soft glow filled the room. Bright Morning stood near the hearth, her light gentle, her face calm. "Breathe," the spirit said quietly. "Your body knows what to do. I will guide you." Grace nodded through tears, barely able to speak. I don't know if I can. You can, Bright Morning said. The strength that carried you through loss will carry you through this. The contractions grew closer. Each one wrung a cry from her chest. The cabin walls shook with wind, but inside, the air felt still, sacred. Grace followed the spirit's steady instructions. Breathe deep, push when her body told her, rest when she could. Hours passed in rhythm with the storm outside. The fire dimmed and flared again. Sweat dampened Grace's forehead despite the cold. Between contractions she clutched Thomas's shirt, whispering his name like a prayer. Bright Morning knelt beside her, the glow from her form illuminating the room. You are stronger than the pain, she murmured. I know it burns. I know it feels endless. But you are bringing life through the same gate I left it. Grace didn't understand at first. Then she saw the tears of light forming in the spirit's eyes. Bright Morning's voice trembled as she continued, When I died here, I was alone. My child came silent into the world. I held her for moments before the cold took us both. I've waited 100 years for this moment, to see life return where mine ended. Grace cried with her. The next contraction hit, fierce and unstoppable. She screamed, gripping the sheets. The spirit's voice rose with hers. That's it. Let the strength rise through you. You are safe. You are not alone. Minutes stretched into hours. The pain became everything. Wild, primal, consuming. Grace thought she might break apart. But she didn't. She couldn't. She bore down again and again, her voice echoing through the cabin, her will stronger than the storm. You're doing beautifully, Bright Morning whispered. Just one more. One more breath. One more push. Grace obeyed. The air split with a sharp cry, high, piercing, alive. A baby's cry. For a moment, the world went silent around that sound. The fire steadied. The wind eased. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Grace collapsed back against the bed, gasping, tears flooding her eyes. Bright Morning's light glowed warmer now, like sunrise breaking through the storm. The spirit's voice was reverent. You did it. You brought life into a place of death. Grace looked down at her daughter, tiny, red-faced, perfect. She wrapped her in a soft blanket and held her close, feeling the flutter of her heartbeat against her chest. You brought hope, Bright Morning said softly, where I brought only sorrow. Grace's voice broke. I couldn't have done it without you. She met the spirit's gaze. Thank you for saving us. Bright Morning shook her head slowly. No, Grace. You saved me. Grace blinked through exhaustion, confused. What do you mean? The spirit smiled, faint and tender. I was bound here by pain. I thought my suffering defined me. But you showed me that love endures even in the ruins of everything we lose. You faced your fear and chose to trust. You proved that even in our greatest pain, we can choose love over bitterness. Grace clutched her daughter tighter, tears streaming freely. You gave me strength when I had none. You gave me peace, Bright Morning whispered. Her glow began to soften, her outline blurring. You gave me what I needed to finally let go. Grace sat up in panic. Wait. Don't leave. The spirit's form flickered, her features fading into the glow. You are never alone, Grace. You carry me now, in every kindness you give, in every time you choose hope instead of fear. Her voice became a whisper, almost part of the wind. Raise her well. Grace reached out, but her hand met only warm air. The light dimmed until the cabin was lit only by the steady fire. For a long time, she sat there holding her newborn daughter, the storm quieting outside. The forest no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, watching, protecting. She pressed a kiss to her baby's forehead. "We're safe now," she whispered. "You're safe." The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling against her mother's chest. Grace closed her eyes, feeling both sorrow and peace in the same breath. The storm had passed. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the wall. In that moment, Grace knew the truth. Life and death had shared the same room, and love had bridged the distance between them. Bright Morning stood near the hearth, her glow softer than ever, her form growing faint. Grace knew what that meant before the spirit spoke. "I must," Bright Morning said, her voice calm, full of warmth. "My time has passed." Grace shook her head, clutching her newborn closer. "No, please. Don't go yet. We still need you." The spirit's smile was gentle. "But yours is just beginning." Her eyes shone with pride and sorrow all at once. "Raise her with courage. Teach her that kindness is not weakness, but the greatest strength a soul can hold. Tell her we honor those who came before us not by clinging to pain, but by choosing better." Grace swallowed hard, tears welling again. "I will," she whispered. "I'll name her after you. I'll call her Dawn." At that, Bright Morning's expression softened into pure peace. "Dawn," she repeated quietly, the word glowing in the air like sunlight through fog. "Perfect." The spirit began to fade, her light blending with the fire's glow until only her voice remained. "You are never alone, Grace." When the last trace of light vanished, the cabin felt changed. Not empty, but calm. The air held warmth instead of sorrow. The place where grief had once ruled now felt blessed, as though every stone and timber carried a quiet benediction. Grace sat by the fire, holding baby Dawn against her chest. Snow still fell outside, but it no longer felt like isolation. It felt like protection. The months passed gently. Dawn grew strong, her laughter filling the cabin that had once echoed with cries. Grace worked the land with steady hands. She learned which herbs healed and which soothed. When her daughter was old enough to walk, they took short trips to Oakridge. At first, people avoided them, the woman who lived alone in the old Peterson place. But over time, curiosity replaced distance. Grace would come to town with bundles of dried herbs or jars of salve, trading them for supplies. The remedies worked, sometimes when nothing else did. Word spread quietly. Soon, neighbors began visiting the cabin. Some came for medicine, others just for her counsel. Grace listened to them with patience, never judging, always gentle. She didn't talk about how she knew what she knew. She never spoke of the spirit who had saved her. That story was sacred, a promise between souls. Years went by. The forest that had once terrified her became her ally. Each season taught her something new. Dawn learned those lessons too. How to read the sky before a storm, how to tell when the river would flood, how to find healing in the wildest places. By the time Dawn was 10, she was fearless. One morning, as sunlight broke through the pines, she looked up at her mother and asked, "Why do we live so far from everyone else?" Grace smiled, her eyes following the sway of the tall firs. She took her daughter's hand and led her to the porch. The forest stretched endlessly before them, vast, alive, familiar. "This place," Grace said softly, "once frightened me more than anything. But it taught me something important, that you're never truly alone if you carry love in your heart." Dawn tilted her head. "Even when no one's around." Grace nodded. "Especially then. Sometimes the things that scare us most are just reflections of our own pain, waiting to be healed." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. For a brief moment, Grace thought she saw a shimmer among the trees, a soft light that could have been the morning sun, or something more. She smiled, not questioning it. She had come to understand what bright morning meant. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing not to let fear decide who you become. Kindness has the power to transform even the darkest moments. Suffering can turn to strength if met with compassion. We are never truly alone, not when we open ourselves to connection. And how we respond to cruelty defines us far more than the cruelty itself. Choosing compassion, again and again, especially when it's hardest, breaks the cycle of pain. That choice, made in quiet corners of the world, is what makes us truly human. Years later, when Grace's hair had turned silver, people still called her the woman from the Peterson place. They said her presence brought calm, her remedies never failed, and her kindness never ran out. Few knew how she came by her wisdom. None knew that the same land where she'd once wept in fear had given her both a friend and a second chance at life. Sometimes, on still nights, Grace would step outside after putting Dawn to bed. The moonlight would spill across the clearing, and for a heartbeat, she'd sense a presence, a whisper in the wind, a warmth in the air. She'd close her eyes and whisper back, "Thank you." Two women, one of flesh, one of spirit, linked across centuries by sorrow, strength, and love. Both had been abandoned by the world. Both had found, in each other, the compassion they were once denied. Their story was proof that even in the deepest isolation, connection is possible. Love and courage can heal wounds that time itself could not. Grace looked up at the stars, holding on to that truth. She smiled. Somewhere, she believed, bright morning smiled back. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share your own stories of courage and kindness. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another powerful tale you won't want to miss. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Remember, you're never alone when you carry love in your heart.